Good afternoon. So my name is Annie Anton. I will be moderating this panel. The panel, in case you are not sure if you're in the right place, is Frontiers of Privacy and Security. It's an honor for me today to introduce our two panelists, although it's not really a panel, but we couldn't come up with a real name for it. It's more of a thing than a panel. We'll see why in a few minutes. So Dan, to my left, is a professor at Dan Solove, is the John Marshall Harlan Research Professor at George Washington University Law School. He has a book that shocked the press this year. It's called Nothing to Hide: The False Tradeoff Between Privacy and Security, and I highly encourage you to go out and rush to buy it. And if it's not in your local store, I'm sure you can find it on Amazon. Exactly. Dan also co-founded the wonderful Privacy Law Scholars Conference with Pursuit Nagel, which just had its fourth running this past month. He was his position at George Washington Law School, the John Marshall Harlan Research Professorship, is named after the justice who came up with the reasonable expectation of privacy test that Dan is actually going to attack today. So that should be kind of interesting. See a thumbs up from Jim, so that's good. To my right is Professor Peter Swire. He's the C. William O'Neill Professor of Law at the Moritz College of Law at Ohio State University. I have heard him recently referred to as the Dean of Privacy. So it's a very illustrious description. He first federally appointed privacy officer in the Clinton administration and recently finished a one-year tour with the Obama administration and the Economic Policy Council working for Larry Summers. And I'm sure he has lots of interesting stories that he can tell about, including how he played tennis with Larry Summers. So, I said this was more of a thing than a panel, and here's why. We're going to have 6 topics, and we're going to have these kind of lightning flash discussions about them. And so we've broken out where each topic will get 8 minutes, and I'm going to be really, really diligent about keeping these two on task and within their allotted time frame, which you know will be challenging. When you hear this sound, oh wait, when you hear this sound, oh, because I turned the volume of the sound off so that my phone went ring. Okay, that's like a rambling wrecking Rorschach horn. When you hear the horn, that means that it's time to switch, and I'm really going to cut them off. And so they will each get 4 minutes for each topic, their opening. There will be a 2-minute response from the other. And then I'm only giving 2 minutes to the audience. If there's time left over at the end, we will give more time to the audience, but we really want to get through these topics, and we think we'll be much more fun if we keep this kind of going. So, without further ado, I would like to go ahead and let Dan start. The first topic is the all or nothing fallacy in privacy and security.
All right. Well, the all or nothing fallacy is something I talked about early on in my book. It's actually part of the book title. It's sort of a false trade-off between privacy and security. And typically when people are discussing, debating privacy and security, they'll take the security measure on one side, the privacy measure on the other, they balance them and see which one weighs more. That's totally the wrong way to balance. And if you look at polls and discussions on privacy, the way they're framed, I think, is also totally wrong. They're framed like this. You know, if the NSA, consider the NSA surveillance program. People will ask, well, do you want the NSA listening in on people's phone calls if it will prevent terrorism? And all these people will say, very, very large percentage of respondents in the polls will say, of course. But that's the wrong question. And it's wrong to talk about security measures as an all or nothing trade-off with privacy. And the reason is that privacy law typically does not require the banning of a security measure. It just requires that security measures are subjected to judicial oversight, that there's certain limitations and controls on what the government can do. So it rarely is all or nothing. It's actually some limitation and some restriction and some oversight. So the proper question to ask is not, do you want the NSA listening in on telephone calls? The proper question to ask people is, do you want the NSA to listen in on telephone calls with a warrant and probable cause or with some kind of judicial oversight? and procedure, or do you want the NSA listening on phone calls without any kind of oversight, without any procedure to do with what they will? And I think most people would say, well, actually, I kind of like the idea of having oversight limitation. It's certainly the case that certain kinds of oversight and certain kinds of judicial process and limitation are going to diminish the effectiveness of a security measure. But that is just a diminished effectiveness. And so what we want to balance when we balance privacy and security is not privacy on the one hand and the security measure on the other, but it's the differential in the security measure between the full security measure without any limitations or oversight, and then the security measure with some diminished effectiveness with the oversight and the limitations. That differential in effectiveness is what gets balanced against privacy. And I think when we balance that, which is the appropriate way to balance, we come up with a very different balance and a very different set of outcomes, but a much more accurate set of outcomes. I think that the all or nothing fallacy skews the balancing of privacy and security much, much more toward the security side than it should be balanced. And I think this improper way of framing the debate actually has really pernicious effects in the outcomes that we have when we're trying to weigh privacy and security.
Dan is characteristically way too reasonable here, and what he's basically saying in the all or nothing fallacy is that we have a lot of nuance, that there's a lot of different goals for privacy, and we should meet all of them. I have a sort of challenge and a suggestion for Dan and Harlan. The challenge is how to get a good TV scene out of what he just said. Because the TV scene from 24 would be the terrorists are at the gate. It's going to happen right now. We have to break the glass and knock everything down. And and our hero is going to torture somebody or get the data, do whatever they want. And I don't know what Dan's TV answer is back to that. And then the security, the suggestion is, a lot of times it's not privacy versus security. The best argument in practice is security versus security. So here's an example. Some of you have heard about data retention ideas, that the phone company should hold on to your phone call data for a long time. My favorite argument against that is, how would the FBI like to have all of its phone calls recorded and kept by AT&T so that people at AT&T and bad guys who penetrate AT&T can see the FBI's phone calls? And as soon as the FBI realizes that they have a security hole with data retention, their security instincts go off, and then they say, "Whoa, not for us. Oh, that's too risky." And then you make the security argument back against the security people, and it's a way to answer back why they don't get everything and why we shouldn't worry about nothing to hide.
And with that, I'm going to grant 4 minutes to the audience. If you have questions or comments. Yes.
In my world, the privacy and security is a completely different dichotomy. My practice, I've helped companies implement this. So what I run into is security people inside the company who are all tasked with protecting the personal information that the organization has. Well, we've applied all the security controls, therefore privacy is taken care of. So I have to go through a whole different routine. That's in a whole different domain of privacy, but for people out in the field actually practicing this stuff, instead of these large national security type issues, it says, in the practice in the field, with the organization, with the system, how do you distinguish between the practice of privacy and security, which are overlapping domains, preventing the security people from thinking that simple controls and technology will accomplish privacy?
I think it's a very valid point. I think that it's true that people often think, well, if we take care of data security, we've got privacy covered, and the two are really different sides of the same coin. You really can't have good security without good privacy, and you can't have really good privacy without good security. You need both, and I think it's really an education thing. It's trying to get them to understand how security will fail without the appropriate level of controls over access to information, without the appropriate policy dimensions when it comes to protecting confidentiality. And I think it really is just getting people to see that privacy and security are not the same thing when it comes to data security, and to think broadly about privacy. The tough thing is it's harder to think about privacy in that it's a more amorphous and a more challenging concept, I think, to get one's head around. And so I think that's why it's sort of easy to say, okay, do a bunch of security measures and we're good. With privacy, there's a lot of different things and a lot more policy choices that don't have as clear answers in a lot of cases.
Just a 2 cents on that. In security, a lot of times it's don't allow the breach. But if the database has every phone call in the history of humankind, that's a privacy threat, even if you have great security around the database. So privacy a lot of times is what do you choose to collect and keep, and security is not letting the bad guys get it. That's a simplified way to draw the line.
Time for one more quick question. Okay, let's keep it going then. Okay, so our next topic is encryption and globalization. An update on India, China, and Russia.
So I became my first CFP in 1994, before some of you were probably like in school. And the biggest topic in those days in computer freedom and privacy was encryption. In those days, the NSA and the FBI were trying to make sure we had leak encryption. And then the administration, the government, came up with this idea for a while of key escrow, where we trust the government to hold on to all the keys, and that way only when they had really, really good reasons would they ever peek at all of their communications. So people used to yell and scream and get all upset at CFP about encryption. And then in 1999, and this was after I was working on these issues in the government, the U.S. government shifted to allowing strong crypto. So when you do, and exporting it overseas. So when you use the internet these days, you can use strong encryption. Now, more than a decade later, encryption is becoming a much bigger issue overseas. You've heard about RIM, BlackBerry in India, and China. And so I'm going to sort of renew the paper I'm working on this year is encryption and globalization. And this chart, which this is the only slides we have today, is to remind us why we want to have encryption on the internet. So up in the top, we have Alice. She's trying to send a message down to Bob in the middle, down at the bottom, and their ISPs are involved. But the thing about the internet is you have all these orange boxes in between. And those orange boxes are all the nodes on the internet. And they have unknown and potentially malicious people in the middle who can intercept all your internet communications, which is now these days with your voice communications. And so weak encryption means many, many intercepts. And since the internet lets us bounce information through India and China and everywhere else, your communications are at the mercy of what happens in these populous countries. Here's what's happening in India. India has a legal limit, maximum 40-bit encryption keys, which means that your PC can break the strong encryption that's allowed in India. The national security folks there, law enforcement folks there, I did a trip to India in March, are focused on terrorism. Their view is that they have state-sponsored terrorism next door and they're scared about it, so they want to be able to read all the communications. And their initial position in India has been keep this 40-bit limit, basically have broken encryption throughout India. Right now, they're trying to repeat all the mistakes in the United States, so there's a serious process where they're proposing shifting to key escrow in India, and that's what the national security folks are pushing for. But the question going forward for India is, can they eventually move to the strong encryption that's the global standard, that's the U.S. position? For instance, can they get support for strong encryption from the commercial sector that processes our banking records and our medical records? Lots and lots of U.S. medical records are being handled in India. They're being shipped in and out of India under rules that prohibit strong encryption. So that's it. That's the story in India that affects our medical records. Is something worth keeping in mind. China has a different way to try to screw up global encryption. The way they're doing it is they're trying to insist that if you have hardware or software in China, you use their own Chinese, non-publicly tested algorithms. But the crypto wisdom from all the people who used to come to CFP, and maybe some of the people here today, is that your encryption is much more secure if it's been repeatedly tested over and over again through a public process. The Chinese algorithms are subject to various risks. There's little reason, because they haven't been tested, to think they're secure. They may have backdoors in them, and they may be used as a trade barrier for global companies that want to do hardware and software in China, and thus interrupt the global supply chain. So going forward, this is to remind you at CFP that encryption used to be a core issue for this conference. Bad encryption threatens privacy, it threatens cybersecurity, it threatens the growth of the internet. And so I'm working this summer and into the fall on a paper on how to update the 1990s policy debate for this new globalized context. And I very much welcome expertise from people here to suggest how we can make these arguments and remind people why having good encryption should be part of the package.